today. So it sounds like this meeting is going to be recorded. Hopefully, you'll be able to play it back if you can actually stand to listen to me a second time around. But I've been asked to talk about the economy and the housing market for this year. As you know, we're really in the middle of the peak season for the housing market across the state of California. And I've got good news, but I also have some not so good news to share. I will be talking about the national economy, and it's pretty evident to me that we're looking at a soft landing at the present time. Then I'll be looking at the state economy because much of what happens here in Southern California, the Inland Empire, and the High Desert depends on how things fare for the state as a whole. We'll drill down to the High Desert and the Inland Empire itself, which, as you can see here, I'm indicating is leading Southern California. Really has done so since we were in the pandemic. And you can see I'm a little bit worried about the real estate market. I just want to lay things out as I see them so that you can act appropriately with your business, your lines of business as you go through this year. We'll talk about that. Mainly talking about prices, which of course drives affordability, interest rate, which also drives affordability and supply. And then we'll wrap things up. So let's get started. I think when I give these presentations using Zoom, it's kind of hard for me to field questions on the fly in the chat. So I'll probably get through US and maybe California, stop and see if you have any questions on those sections, and then we'll move forward to the others.
Okay. And I can keep an eye on that as well for you.
Great. Thanks, Christy. I appreciate it.
No problem.
Let's see here. Let's advance. There we go. So give me a second here. Okay, so you've probably been hearing for some time that the economy hopefully will have a soft landing. What do we mean by a soft landing for the U.S. economy? Well, the Fed has been increasing rates since early 2022. We all know that. And the reason it's been increasing rates has been to engage in a fight against inflation. So inflation's as high as it had been in over 20 years, peaked back in the middle of 2022. And the way to bring inflation down is to slow the economy down. The economy, if you look on the right-hand side here, the annual growth rate of the economy, especially coming out of the pandemic in 2021, was quite strong. Of course, we're recovering from that huge decline that occurred in 2020 itself. But there were all sorts of things that caused inflation to heat up. We had supply chain disruptions. We had labor market disruption. There were problems with production, not just here in the United States, but around the globe. All that gave rise to inflation that almost hit 10% in the middle of 2022. So the Fed had to fight that battle because what it really wants to do is get our background inflation rate down close to 2%. And so despite its effort to slow the economy down, it's advanced pretty nicely. And so what you're looking over here on the left-hand side is the quarterly level of GDP. The pandemic downturn occurred here where you've got the red bars. But more recently, here in the first quarter of 2024, GDP rose by 1.6% compared to the prior quarter and is up 3% on a year-over-year basis. So it's still a fairly strong performance for the U.S. economy, even though the Fed has been raising rates to slow the pace of growth down. And we think it's going to have the desired effect. The economy is going to grow more slowly here in 2024. But I don't see a recession in sight. One of the reasons is that the consumer sector, which accounts for about 2/3 to 70% of the economy, continues to increase its expenditures. Here you're looking at expenditures by consumers, households, on both goods and services. Most of the time when you and I think about what we buy, we think about the goods that we buy, but the fact of the matter is that we spend more money on services these days than we do on goods. That's why the red line, which is about $10 trillion of economic activity, is the indicator of how much we're spending on services, whereas the amount we spend on goods is a little bit less. It's around $5 trillion. And so the point is that households continue to increase their spending. It's a major driver to the U.S. economy. And households are spending in part because their wages are going up. I just took a look at wages against inflation, and over the past 10 years, wages have been increasing faster than inflation, believe it or not. This is for the U.S. as a whole. And over the past year, the same is also true. So people have more spending power, slightly more spending power, and have had it as time has passed. What happened that's noteworthy in this figure is that during the pandemic, because we could not go out to eat, that's a service, we couldn't take trips, another service, we couldn't engage in other entertainment activities, we sat in front of our computers. You've heard me describe this before in previous presentations. Sat in front of our computers, pressed that order button for Amazon.com and other online ordering. And so our share of purchases that went to goods went up rather dramatically. This is that dashed line that I'm referring to. Before the pandemic, about a third of our total spending went to goods. In the heat of the pandemic, over 36% went to our purchases of goods as opposed to services. That has drifted back down, but it is still elevated compared to before the pandemic. It's around 35% right now. This tells me that the household sector is not fully adjusted to the post-pandemic era, because I would expect in time that this share is going to fall closer to 1/3 where it was before the pandemic. The main thing is that consumer spending is on the rise, continues to advance, and so that helps drive GDP, overall spending forward. There really are other parts to the U.S. economy, as you know, that we need to account for. And when we take a look at the overall picture for GDP, which is one of the basic indicators of the economy, we not only have to look at consumer spending, we also have to look at business spending. And here, the items shown in green mean that these indicators are up on a year-over-year basis. So investment spending in non-residential structures, that's both new office and industrial buildings as well as renovations to those, that's up. Investment or purchases of intellectual property like software and the like, also up. Equipment that goes into offices, also up. And residential structures up. This is all for the first quarter of this year compared to a year earlier. So business investment spending is headed in the right direction, the same direction that consumer spending is headed in. And those are the two parts of the private sector in the U.S. economy that really drive us forward. Of course, international trade is not just important to the overall economy nationally, but it's also important here in Southern California with our ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, with the cargo activity that takes place at the Ontario International Airport. Imports are up. They're up 1.3% annually. So our economy is doing relatively better than some of our trading partners at the present time. And when our incomes are rising, we not only buy domestically produced goods, but we also buy imports. And so that's what you're seeing there. Exports are flat. We were exporting to our trade partners at an increased rate for the last couple of years, but that slowed down in part because the dollar is stronger. So international trade is kind of a mixed bag. Government spending, which is the fourth segment of the U.S. economy, is up 2.2% in year over year. That's federal spending by itself. You know, it's worth noting that federal spending, which is the one that we hear a lot about, is only 40% of all spending. It's local government and state government spending that accounts for the majority of government spending. But I think it's worth pointing out that while spending is up on a year-over-year basis, government spending is a declining share of GDP. In 2023, it was 6.6%. Back in 2010, it was 8.5%. In the middle of the pandemic, it was 7%. So we continue to have an economy that is predominantly a private sector economy. It's driven by private sector spending on the part of consumers and on the part of businesses, and that's a good thing. One concern that individuals have when looking at government spending is how much are interest outlays accounting for as a share of GDP or as a share of total spending. And as a share of GDP, interest outlays on the part of the federal government are about 2.4%. The concern is that with deficit spending, at some point, servicing that debt it can crowd out spending on other things. And thus far, that really has not been a problem because interest rates were low until just the last couple of years. So we'll have to monitor that as we go forward. The bottom line is that when you look at all the sectors of the U.S. economy, it's continuing to advance, and it looks very much like a soft landing is the appropriate way to characterize the U.S. economy here in 2024. That's also true when you look at the labor market. So really, when we look at the U.S. economy or any economy, we look at its vital signs. We look at GDP, which measures economic activity, gross domestic product. We look at the labor market, which is what you're seeing right now. And we also look at inflation. Those are the three most important vital signs of the economy. So let's look at that second vital sign, the labor market. Here you got the unemployment rate shown through the most recent time period. It's 3.9%. It's been edging up, but this is still in the range that corresponds to where we were before the pandemic. And quite honestly, if you look back historically to find other periods of time where we had an unemployment rate below 4%, you have to go back 50 years to the 1960s. So this is a good sign. The labor market continues to be one where it's lean and the unemployment rate is relatively low. Job growth in the U.S. economy is twice the long-run average. So over the last several decades, the U.S. economy typically grows by about 0.8%. In the month of April, it grew by 1.6%. So these are all signs to me, excuse me, that tell me that the labor market continues to show strength or at least steadiness as we go forward. Now, remember that the Fed wants to slow the economy down to bring inflation in check. Slowing the economy down means that GDP is going to grow more slowly. It also means that job growth is also going to slow down some. And accordingly, the number of job openings, which is what you see here in red, has been declining. So that's evidence that the economy is indeed slowing down. Firms that are hiring people are hiring fewer numbers of people, or they've got fewer job openings, but that number nationally still exceeds the number of people who are out of work, which is what you're looking at in black. So the red line is the number of jobs that are open and available, and the black line represents the number of unemployed workers. Those numbers are getting closer to each other, but there's still a fairly sizable gap between the two. And as we go through the balance of 2024, I would expect that this gap is going to shrink, that the unemployment rate, which is currently at 3.9%, is probably going to edge above 4%, because all of that occurs as the economy slows down. The economy is expected to slow, but it's not going to stall out. It's not going to tip into recession. So that slowdown to what economists might say is a steady growth path is what we're talking about when we're talking about a soft landing. Now, that hopefully will occur as the rate of inflation drops. Here you're looking at the rate of inflation on a year-over-year basis going back over the last few years. And you can see that the rate of inflation almost hit 10%. It was 9%, I'm sorry, back in the middle of 2022. We just got an inflation reading yesterday from the consumer price index of 3.4%. It's come down slightly from the month before. But just taking a look at this graph over on the right-hand side, you can see that the inflation rate's been in that low 3% range for quite some time. The Fed would like to see it drop by about another percentage point based on the consumer price index. But what's happening over on the left-hand side is that some elements of our spending that drive inflation continue to register higher. So inflation for all items, which is what you were looking at a moment ago, has come in at the rate shown back here. which is 3.4%. Food's up a little bit more than 2%. Energy's up a little bit more than 2%. And then you've got all items minus food and energy. The reason these are omitted from the green bar is that food and energy prices tend to be more volatile than the prices of other things that we buy. But one of the important things that's in this green bar is housing costs. Over here on the right-hand side, housing costs account for 1/3 of the consumer price index, and both rents and home prices have been going up. That's really been the primary driver behind these inflation rates that are just not coming down. They're not dropping below that 3% threshold, much less getting to 2. So a slowdown in the rate of inflation has to be, or at least the way inflation is measured here, has to come from a slowdown in rent growth and a slowdown in home prices. Now, I got to mention this before I move on. There are a lot of ways of measuring price increases or the rate of inflation. One is the consumer price index that everybody knows about. There's the personal consumption expenditure index, and that's the PCE that you see here. That was up 2.7% in March. That's the indicator that the Fed really pays attention to. Inflation's measured a little bit differently using that indicator, and the housing component is not nearly prominent in calculating the rate of inflation with the personal consumption expenditure index. It's up 2.7%. If that can get below 2.5%, I think the Fed's going to start cutting interest rates, but it will do so slowly. When will that happen? Well, I looked at things like the producer price index, which is the PPI that you see here. It's up just 2.1% for the month of March. The bottom line is that inflation is headed in the right direction. It's just not headed in that direction as fast as many people would like to see, especially people like those of us in the housing industry. Housing is an interest rate sensitive part of our economy. And if inflation's high, interest rates are high, that tends to dampen activity in these interest rate sensitive segments of the economy. So we're looking for that rate of inflation to drop below 2.5% to give the Fed a sense that it can indeed reduce rates. So let's talk about rates. I think this is a very important point to consider. As you can see by the headline of this slide, I argue that from the period of time just after the Great Recession, roughly about 2009 through the first part of 2022, we were in an environment where interest rates were ultra low. And that was in part due to the fact that inflation was very much in check. Inflation averaged maybe 2% throughout much of the period that is bracketed here by this ultra low green bracket. So we had low inflation. We had a very low policy rate, the Fed funds rate, which is the one that you see here, the effective federal funds rate. So we had a very low effective federal funds rate. Those of you who were in the business back in 2018 would remember that the Fed tried to move its federal funds rate to normal back then, and it tried to do so over the course of several months, and that caused the housing market to stall out a bit. Then we had the pandemic, and the Fed had to resort to something to stimulate the economy once again, not put a brake on the economy. So it cut rates back to this rock bottom rate that you're seeing over here on the bottom right-hand side. But since then, since early 2022, we've seen the Fed raise that Fed funds rate, which is the key policy rate. We've also seen the yield on the 10-year Treasury, which is the most important indicator for all types of long-term interest rates. We've seen that climb as well. But the point behind this graph is that most of us were well acquainted with this time period of the last maybe 14 or 15 years when rates were ultra low until very recently. Take a look at this figure. This goes back to 1990, and it's the same set of indicators, the federal funds rate in black and the yield on the 10-year Treasury shown in green. And you can see that going back to 1990, The yield on the 10-year was 8.5%. Now it's just 4. Okay. The federal funds rate was over 8% compared to 5.25, where it is right now at 5.3. And on top of putting current rates into historical perspective, I also want to point out that the economy can move forward, and even the housing market can move forward in a high interest rate environment. We saw strong home sales, especially at the U.S. level, not so much at the state level, in the early 1990s, even with those high interest rates. So buyers who are really the target of these high interest rates, they're the ones most affected by high interest rates, have to rethink their expectations and what they can afford in order to become homeowners in the present market. I will have a graph in just a moment on the mortgage rates, the 30-year mortgage, and have some additional discussion on that. But I just wanted to tie what's been happening with inflation to what's been happening to the interest rate environment in general, but point out that while interest rates are up compared to our recent memory, they're still low by historic standards. And that's no consolation to anybody who wants to go out and get a loan for a car, for a house, or anything else, because interest rates are higher compared to a few years ago. But they don't necessarily mean that the economy is going to stall out. So as I take a look at this collection of information about the U.S. economy here in 2024, I expect that the rate of growth for GDP is still going to be around long-term normal. So it's going to be 2%. The economy is not going to stall out. We're going to see the unemployment rate rise and average 3.9% for the year, but it'll probably be above 4% by year end. And inflation for the year as a whole is expected to come down as we get further into the year. And for all of this year, the inflation rate would be about 2.6%. A 2% growth rate is right around the long run average growth rate for the economy. The unemployment rate, as I said, is low, but it is rising. And you saw how job openings still exceed the number of unemployed, but that gap is closing. The Fed is still not yet seeing that inflation has fallen to its target. So this is the issue for interest rates. The Fed policy, which means that Fed funds rates 5.33%, relatively high, that coupled with an economy that is showing a steady or solid economic performance means that the Fed is not going to be in a hurry to cut rates. So that's quite a bit different than what we heard at the beginning of the year. At the beginning of the year, the Fed thought that inflation was going to come down faster than it has, and that the economy, and that would be in part because the economy would slow down. The economy has slowed, just not as much as the Fed might have expected. So this high interest rate environment is going to be around for a while. I just want to shift your attention for a moment from what's happening now and over the next 6 to 18 months to what's going to be happening over the near future, the next 1 to 3 years. And with that, I'm talking about demographics. We've seen population growth in the U.S. really slow down over the last few years, especially during the pandemic, but that has now picked up. Labor force growth has also increased. We're seeing people enter the labor force pipeline, if you will, to fill the void that's being created by members of the boomer generation who are retiring in large numbers. And that's a good thing. It's a good thing for the overall state of the economy as we go forward, because in order to fuel our economy, one of the most important inputs or ingredients to fueling that economy has to be growth in our labor force. So whereas a year or two ago, I was concerned about that labor force stagnating and not really growing, it does appear as though growth has resumed once again. That's a good thing. Some final thoughts on the U.S. economy before we move on to the state. So I said we'd grow at about 2% this year. The long run growth rate of the economy is thought to be around 2.2%, so a little bit slower than that long run growth rate. And that's okay. The economy is not stalling out. It's just growing below par. Okay. It's going to be that's symptomatic of the effort on the part of the Fed to slow the economy down. The unemployment rate also has a long-term target, which is about 4.4%. We're well below that. And so, not that I want to see people lose their jobs, but from the overall health of the economy perspective, seeing the unemployment rate at 3.9 right now means that that labor market is overly tight compared to the long-term benchmark. So we could see the labor market weaken a little bit and still see the economy advance. Some of you have been hearing in the news this term stagflation, which was something that popped up back in the 1970s. Stagflation refers to a situation where, on a sustained basis, there's little or no economic growth. That is to say, GDP doesn't grow by very much, if at all, but inflation is high. Well, inflation is no longer high. It's still higher than our target, but it's coming back down to earth. So the idea of bringing the word stagflation into our dialogue about the current state of the economy, I think is an exaggeration. So, when you start hearing people talk about stagflation, think about what I've said here. Yes, the economy is slowing down, and it's slowing down because of the Fed's efforts to slow the economy down in order to bring inflation back down to earth. But it does not necessarily mean that the economy is going to stall out. And with 2% growth expected for 2024, and with a very tight labor market, there is no indication the economy is stalling out. And another final thought: we hear a lot these days about how consumers are really expressing negative sentiments about the state of the economy. They have a poor outlook on the economy. They think their own situation is not so great. Consumers are like, hey, they're like people. They are people. Oftentimes people say one thing and they do another. And that's surely showing up and has been for the last 18 months or so. Consumer sentiment has been mixed at best and at times has been quite poor, as this quote suggests. But the fact of the matter is that consumer spending is up by 2.9%, which is on a real basis. That's after inflation. So consumers continue to spend, being 2/3 of the economy. With consumer spending up, we're going to continue to see the overall economy advance. So as an economist, I prefer to look at how people actually behave with respect to their spending. And I don't spend as much time worrying about what they say, what their sentiments are, because if they're continuing to spend, that means that the economy is going to continue to move forward. Let me move on now to talk just briefly about the California economy. And here we're talking about shifts in the economy that have occurred relative to the pandemic period. The unemployment rate for California is low, but it's edging up. It's 5.3%. Let's put that into perspective. So it's, as you can see here in this graph, it's higher than that of the US. But typically the difference between the US rate, well, typically California's rate is higher than the US because California's mix of industries is different from the US as a whole. So we almost always see that those blue bars are higher than the red line, the black line that represents the US unemployment rate. And the gap between the two is typically about 1.4%, which is what you see right now. So while the unemployment rate is over 5% and is edging up, it's consistent with what we're seeing for the US economy, and it's consistent with the long-term pattern that we see between the state economy and the US economy. Job growth in California is a little bit slower than that of the US at the present time. These numbers only go through March because we only have March numbers for the state, 1.2%. So it's compared with the March number for the US, 1.9%. This is the year-over-year percentage growth in wage and salary jobs in the non-agricultural side of the economy. And so you take a look at this graph and you can see that there were periods of time where the blue bars are higher than the black. That means that the California economy was growing more quickly or adding jobs more quickly than the US as a whole. More recently, it's been the other way around. The US economy has been adding jobs more quickly than California. So this is one of the challenges of California. It lags in terms of its creation of jobs compared to the US as a whole. Having said that, it's still on par with, or actually exceeding, the long-term average for the state. So the average job growth for the state on year-over-year terms is 1% per year, and we're at 1.2% per year. So just because the rate of job creation has slowed and is slower than that of the United States does not mean that the state economy is stalling out. In fact, it still has a gap between where it was before the pandemic and where it is now. It still needs to close that gap. It still has a labor force gap relative to the pre-pandemic era. That is to say, the state's labor force is still a couple 100,000 shy of where it was before the pandemic. So this is the wrinkle in the soft landing story. The soft landing story suggests that you've got an economy that is flying high and needs to land softly as the Fed cools the economy down with a series of rate hikes. But for the state of California and for much of coastal Southern California, it's the other way around. The recovery from the pandemic hasn't even been completed yet. So the idea of a soft landing is really quite different here. We're talking about getting back to where we were before the pandemic, and that's something the state still needs to do, and neighboring counties like LA and Orange County have yet to do as well. But at least we're seeing growth. We're moving in the right direction. We're closing those gaps little by little. We have an equivalent for California to U.S. gross domestic product or economic activity. It's California gross state product. And this figure simply tells us that gross state product for the state of California generally follows that of the U.S. So if you want to know how the economy is doing here in California, take a look at U.S. GDP. So for the California economy, if we take a look at the indicators that we've talked about thus far, the pace of growth has slowed, but it's on par with the U.S. as a whole. The labor market is seeing that the unemployment rate is going up somewhat, but it's still in line with these long-term metrics that I've shared with you today. So it's very unlikely that the California economy is going to slip into recession as a result of the rate hikes that have been so front and center to economic policy over the last couple of years. So I think that's the reassuring backdrop that we have as we look at the regional economy. So jobs are at the long-term growth rate. In contrast to the U.S. economy, where there are more openings than there are unemployed, it's the other way around for California. So this is one of the troubling aspects of the California economy. There are more job openings than there are, there are more unemployed than there are job openings. And I hear this, I talk to people all the time about their desire to find a job, and the right job just not out there. It's a slightly different story for California. We have not fully recovered from the pandemic, and so we continue to have more unemployed than job openings. And we're shifting the emphasis in our economy. During the pandemic, logistics employment really took off for the state as well as for the Inland Empire and High Desert. And tech also took off during the pandemic. Both of those sectors have pulled back or declined. Logistics employment, though, is still higher than it was before the pandemic. And I would anticipate that tech employment is going to take off before too long at the state level, especially in the Bay Area, as generative AI and all the development that goes with that triggers job gains. The things that we count on for job growth going forward through the balance of this year are the industries shown here in the bottom bullet: healthcare, leisure and hospitality, professional, scientific, and technical services, and private education. These have all been a major source of job growth, even as logistics and tech jobs have been cut. We don't have a lot of time to talk about these long-term challenges for California today, but we'll talk a little bit about high housing costs, but the long-term implications we won't be able to get into. But everybody knows that that's a huge challenge for all of California and Southern California. The population and the labor force are finally on the rise, but we're still seeing the population and labor force numbers are below where they were at the time of the pandemic. And then you probably are well aware of the fiscal concerns. During the pandemic, there was a fair amount of stimulus that entered the state and local coffers from the federal government level that supported state and local budgets. That's gone away. We're looking at a state budget deficit that's measured in the tens of billions of dollars. And, one of the real issues that popped up at times like this is that our tax system here in California is structured in such a way that we know we're going to see a volatile stream of state tax revenues. And so as long as we have our current tax system, especially the income tax system, where a big share of revenue is dependent on high income earners whose income streams are volatile and maybe dictated by the ups and downs of the stock market, or more generally the financial markets, we know we're going to have periods of boom and bust when it comes to the state budget. So we just need to be aware of these things as we move through the balance of 2024 and into 2025. Let me stop for a second. I'm looking at the chat and I don't see, I see one question about whether the labor market includes legal and illegal immigrants, migrants. And in answer to that question, it includes, so that when the survey is done to measure the people in the labor force, they don't ask about whether or not that person is legal or illegal, just whether or not that person is working, which means that person's in the labor force, or if the person's not working, is that person actively looking for work? If the person's actively looking for work, that person is also in the labor force but unemployed. And then people who say they're not actively looking for work are not measured as a part of the labor force. So the answer to your question is yes, those categories of people, migrants, both legal and illegal, are picked up in those numbers that are reported each month. So let's see. Let's talk about.
There is one other question. It
Yeah.
says unemployed numbers are only based on people that are actually collecting unemployment. Once they're no longer eligible for benefits, they're no longer counted. So the actual number is much higher. Is that correct?
Again, the number of unemployed is independent of that as well. If someone is collecting unemployment benefits, then we know they're unemployed and they would be included in those numbers. But this is actually, the unemployment calculations don't depend on whether the person's getting unemployment or not. The respondents, there's a survey every month, and the respondents in the survey are asked whether they're employed or not, regardless of whether they're getting unemployment benefit. So anybody who is unemployed, and remember, this is a survey. It's a survey of about maybe 80 or 90,000 people across the U.S., which is a sufficiently large survey sample to get a good read on the economy, get a good read on the labor market. But it is independent of the whole apparatus that pays out unemployment insurance benefits. There's a completely separate survey. Hope that helps. But speaking of unemployment and the labor market, as we move into the Inland Empire and high desert analysis, I thought I'd share with you the current state of the labor market for the high desert communities. We've got Adelanto all the way down to Victorville, with unemployment rates ranging between 5.8% for Barstow and 9.8% for Adelanto. And then the overall average unemployment rate across these communities is 7.1%. So you have a labor force across these communities. So there are unincorporated communities for which I don't have data, just the way this is reported. So across the region, you've got 141,000 in the labor force, about 131,000 employed across these incorporated cities and Mount Maker census designated place, corresponding to and then 10,000 unemployed, corresponding to a 7.1% unemployment rate. down here at the bottom, it shows that the high desert numbers correspond to about 14% of the total for San Bernardino County in terms of both labor force and employment, and 19% of unemployment. So you've got the county unemployment rate here for reference, 5.1% versus 7.1% for the high desert. I would point out that in San Bernardino County, the labor force has grown very little over the last 2 years. One of the stories you keep hearing about, I think, is that in contrast to the coastal counties, the Inland Empire, the Riverside and San Bernardino County region, has seen population growth. That is true, but labor force growth, which increased during the pandemic in San Bernardino and Riverside County, has kind of stalled out over the last couple of years. It's plateaued. Just worth knowing that as the economy moves forward, the big question is whether that labor force is going to grow or not. I think it will, just not as fast as it has. Here are the unemployment rates across the state. And in San Bernardino County, the unemployment rate a year ago in March was 4.3%. It's up to 5.1% now. So that's evidence that the economy has slowed down. And I'll explain how this is showing up in just a moment when we look at the detailed numbers. Even though the unemployment rate's rising, the Inland Empire is actually outperforming the rest of Southern California in terms of its jobs, its total jobs relative to the pre-pandemic era. This blue, green line, I guess I'm somewhat colorblind today. I keep pulling out the wrong colors, and I apologize. But the green line shows the Inland Empire job base relative to February of 2020. And so it's at about 106, 107% of where it was back in February of 2020. The dashed line would correspond to fully recovering any job losses that occurred during the pandemic. And you can see here that LA County still has not, that Orange County has barely done so. And here are the job numbers for March. So for March, the Riverside San Bernardino County region has about 1.7 million jobs, about the same, a little bit less than Orange County. LA has about 4.6 million jobs, and you've got smaller counties as well. What's happening at the industry level? Well, we're seeing that job gains are occurring in healthcare, construction, government. We added a total of 26,500 jobs across the region, a 1.6% increase from March of last year to March of this year. Most of that's coming from healthcare, and a lot of it is also coming from gains in government jobs and so on. But we're also seeing job losses in some of these other industries, including manufacturing and leisure and hospitality, and then logistics, which is wholesale trade plus transportation and warehousing. These two sectors taken together have been losing jobs since late 2021. And that's important because if you take a look at the next figure, you'll see that logistics jobs, in percentage terms, during the pandemic, accounted for somewhere around 17% of all the jobs in the region. That's edged down now. It's about 16%. At peak, this sector accounted for 286,000, almost 287,000 jobs. Now we're looking at a smaller number, excuse me, around 250,000 jobs. But it's worth noting that we still have more jobs in this sector than we had before the pandemic ensued. So the news stories that you're hearing about the logistics sector collapsing or declining against where it was during the pandemic, it's only partly true. This is still a very strong and very important sector in the overall economy here in the Inland Empire. But you also need to know which other sectors of the economy are very prominent. And so this figure shows the share of jobs by industry, by these major industry groups. Healthcare accounts for 16% of the jobs in the overall region. Government, a little bit less than 16% of all jobs. Here's the transportation and warehousing, which is one part of logistics. It's shaded in blue along with wholesale trade. Taken together, they account for about 16% of jobs. So putting that combined sector on par with healthcare and government. But you also have very important contributions from leisure and hospitality and retail trade. Somewhat smaller job counts are associated with construction and administrative support related jobs. Then you move further down the list and you've got some others where the share of jobs is quite a bit smaller. Now, I've highlighted with this pattern the industries that tend to create growth in the regional economy. So you've got transportation and warehousing, manufacturing, wholesale trade, professional, scientific, and technical services. These are all industries that have some type of economic activity where the firms in these industries are trading and selling stuff to customers who are outside the region. And when that happens, they trigger a pattern of economic growth in the region. So you've got these key sectors that make growth happen in the region. And then these other sectors, mostly in green, are sectors that serve the local population. They're called local population serving sectors, healthcare, leisure and hospitality, which is kind of a hybrid. You've got restaurants that serve the local population, entertainment venues that serve both the local population and visitors, and hotels. But mostly those job counts are in restaurants. So that's local population serving, as is retail trade. The point is that the Inland Empire mix of industries is tilted heavily toward these local population serving industries. If we want to see the local economy grow going forward, we want to see growth in these industries that are shaded with these patterns: transportation and warehousing, wholesale trade, manufacturing, professional, scientific, and technical services. So that's kind of the long-term goal that the region should envision, figuring out how to sustain growth and expansion in these sectors of the economy in order to expand the economic pie, which then can be shared around these population serving sectors. So now let's talk about housing. And, I always like to at least offer a perspective on housing that is upbeat. But we got our challenges this time around here in 2024, what I'm calling triple trouble. Let's first take a look at the high desert, and then we'll talk more generally about housing. So we've got high prices in the high desert region. These are the numbers that are courtesy of the California Association of Realtors. I also received some data from the High Desert Association that I was unable to incorporate into this graphic. The report, or I should say the CAR news release, is coming out tomorrow. So we'll have new numbers tomorrow. But the median price for the month of March was $421,500. That's up 8% from a year earlier. So that's a good sign, at least for home sellers. Sales, though, were down 23% compared to a year earlier. And this is the real challenge. When you've got high interest rates, that tends to put a dent in sales. When you have high interest rates and high prices, both of those adversely affect affordability, as you know. And that has really caused the level of sales to drop off. Now, this history of sales goes back about 15 years. This black line going across the middle here is the average level of sales for the region over that time period since 2010. And you can see that sales, which are represented by these bars, in the last several years have never even come close to that long run average. Now, the population in the region has grown. Number of housing units has gone up. But what's happened in this time period since then? Well, prices have increased and affordability has fallen. Then interest rate hikes have further eroded affordability. But there are other things that have happened too. Remember that back in 2017, we had a change in tax policy at the federal level that changed the treatment of state and local taxes, put a limit on that, the so-called SALT limit. And then property mortgage interest deductions have also been affected. So the subsidy, if you will, through the federal tax system to home ownership is not what it was a number of years ago. So that's also affected home sales activity. Then if you go back and you look at this history, you can see that sales have been declining even before. Remember that Dodd-Frank was a law that was passed back in 2009 in the aftermath of the financial crisis. And with Dodd-Frank, further restrictions were imposed on qualifying for a mortgage. And that shrunk the pool of qualified buyers more or less permanently going forward. So these are the kinds of things that long-term things that we need to keep in mind when we take a look at the fact that home sales are low relative to any sort of long-term history. If we zoom out and we take a look at the county level, you can see for San Bernardino County, the median price was nearly $500,000 in March. It was up 4.8% month to month. So that's a nice start of busy season bounce. It's up 5.2% compared to a year earlier. But home sales are down marginally, 1.5% compared to a year ago. So the challenge this year will be to see how home sales fare. We are fairly certain home prices are going to continue to advance, but home sales, I think, are going to struggle. Now, one of the reasons home sales are going to advance is that supply is still very low. The average unsold inventory since 2005, and 2005 is an important year because that was when the housing industry kind of went online in a big way, started putting a lot more information online, which enabled transactions to move more quickly and so on. So the average since 2005 is about 4.4 months inventory. We continue to see very low inventory levels in San Bernardino County over the past year. That's going to keep upward pressure on home prices. And in the high desert region, the unsold inventory index was just 3.2 months compared to 5.6 months average over that same time period. So we've got upward pressure on home prices as a result of a very lean supply of existing homes. Mortgage rates are up, but as this figure shows, while they are up compared to a couple of years ago, they're nowhere close to historic highs. So I thought I really needed to show this to you, because if you were in the business just over the last 10 years or so, this is that ultra low interest rate environment that I've been talking about. This is what it looks like for the 30-year mortgage. But this figure goes all the way back to 1971, I believe. And you can see, believe it or not, that there was a period of time when interest rates, that is to say the 30-year mortgage was about 16%. And so what I did to give you a feel for the trajectory of mortgage rates over the last 40 years was for this week in each of the years shown, starting in 1984 and moving forward in 10-year increments, I grabbed the interest rate for those particular weeks. So it was 13.9% 40 years ago during this week, 8.7%. This is no consolation to your home buyers who can't afford to buy, but I think it's important to understand what the historical track record's been. 8.7% in 1994. That was around the time we bought our house. 6.34 in 2004. Then the ultra low period, you see that in 2014, we had a rate of 4.2%. Not the lowest ever, but it gives you a feel for how low things got relative to where we are today. So it's this recent history that, of course, is so important to the would-be buyers of today. And that high interest rate today compared to a year ago is contributing to an affordability index as calculated by CAR of 27%. That means 27% of households in San Bernardino County can afford this median priced home. The reason is that the minimum qualifying income for this home with standard underwriting procedures and so on is $124,000, almost $125,000. But the median household income for San Bernardino County is just about $83,000. So affordability is a problem. It's a problem, as you can see, not just for San Bernardino County, but for all of Southern California. And you've got, for comparison, this affordability index for the U.S. as a whole, which is currently at 37%. Now, one of the problems is that we're not building enough housing. I've been talking about this for years, 25 years to be specific, maybe more. And this black line on this figure tells us roughly the number of new housing units we've been needing for the last 20 years or so. And these bars show that we've come nowhere close over the recent and more distant history to that housing need number. This year, based on the numbers we've seen so far through March, I don't think we're going to get anywhere close to it as well. So when you've got population growth and then you've got overcrowding and other kinds of stresses on the housing market, one response is going to be higher home prices and higher rents. That's what we've been seeing for quite some time. You can alleviate that stress in part by building more housing units. Has not happened at the state level to the degree needed, nor in the Inland Empire, where here we're seeing that last year there were 20,268 units built. In 2022, there were about 17,000 housing units built. That should be compared with the housing needs, which are estimated to be closer to 38,000 on an annual basis through 2029. So this just gives you a feel for the new housing that has not been forthcoming, but really would be needed to rein in the increase in home prices that we've seen over the past several years. And the rental market's tight. 4% rent constitutes essentially a fully rented market. And in the Inland Empire, we've got a vacancy rate for the first quarter that's slightly below that. We've got over here on the right-hand side in Inland Empire rental rate that's a little over $2,500 a month, up from a year earlier. So we've got a very tight rental market with rents that are edging up, even as home prices on the for sale market are edging up as well. So it's been a difficult year, I know, both for those of you in the industry and for your clients. And as we look at this year, 2024, hate to say it, but kind of more of the same. Elevated mortgage rates, so that's one of the three in the triple trouble that I entitled this section, because of a combination of Fed policy and the strength of the economy. Those high interest rates limit the pool of prospective buyers, qualified buyers, that limits demand. But in the background, just numerically, when you take a look at the demographics of the Inland Empire and the high desert, you've got a large age cohort, the millennials, who are in their prime home buying and household formation years. But many of them are being left out in the cold because of the fact that interest rates are high. So once rates begin to decrease, I think you're going to see a lot of action, especially as that decrease in rates, we get a sense of the trajectory. If we know that the decline in mortgage rates is going to be more measured as opposed to being something that happens quickly, then you're probably going to see some activity in fairly short order in the tail end of this year. And I don't expect to see the supply of homes change anytime soon. That's what you see in the bottom of this slide, because people are in love with their mortgages. The current homeowners are in love with their mortgages because they refinanced at very low rates or they bought at very low rates. And we're seeing a very limited production of new homes. So that's going to keep upward pressure on homes as we go forward. So it's good for sellers, not so good for buyers. Buyers have to weigh their options. I often talk about how buyers have a trifecta that they try to win. They want to find the right house at the right price and at the right mortgage rate. And ideally, you get all three, but that's very hard to get. If you can get two out of the three, that would be good. But the triple trouble problem is that home prices are high, selection is limited, and interest rates are high. So your clients are going to be relying on you like never before to help navigate the housing market at the present time if we're talking about buyers. And the same is true of sellers, but especially the buyers who are trying to figure out how to become homeowners. Maybe they're at a point in their life cycle where they're a couple and they have kids, or they have their first child and they want to move to a house from an apartment, and they kind of need to do that regardless of interest rates. So they're going to really need your expertise, your knowledge of the market to help enable them to become that first-time home buyer, and then perhaps in time they can trade up Maybe they can't buy the house they want right now, but they can buy a house that meets their needs in the present time with an eye on moving in just a few years, or maybe switching from an adjustable rate mortgage that they need to get into now to a fixed rate mortgage once they get sufficient amount of equity, which is also almost inevitable here in the state of California, regardless of which market you happen to be in. So I know I've gone a little bit past time, so let me wrap up. Um, any outlook for the economy involves some wild cards, and wild cards in part uncertainty on where the economy is headed, which means that people who have to make decisions about themselves or their firms, their businesses, and so on, are going to be reluctant to move forward uh, without some degree of hesitation. Um, so we still have pandemic hangover effects. I kind of addressed those. We're not sure when the Fed's going to cut rates, but we think that that's likely later on this year, and maybe one rate this year instead of the three they were originally advertised. The inflation rate's headed in the right direction, but there's still some uncertainty about that. I think we're getting a clearer picture, but you really want to pay attention to that personal consumption expenditure inflation rate rather than the CPI. The election itself is going to and has imparted some uncertainty on the overall state of the economy as we go forward. Because if there are any big changes that might take place with the election, businesses are going to want to wait to see what happens. So that always causes some hesitation. Then we have all these things at the global level that are heightening the level of uncertainty and causing us concern about global security. I talked a little bit about the labor force situation for the U.S. The situation here in California is that we're finally seeing that the labor force is growing, but we're still finding ourselves short in terms of where we stood before the pandemic. Each of these things, I know it's a long list, but each of these things adds a little bit of uncertainty to the current situation. But even so, the U.S. economy is going to grow. That's pretty much baked in the cake based on what we have seen and looking at the numbers today. So I'm cautiously bullish about where the economy is going as we go through the balance of 2024. It does mean, though, that the housing market is going to have a tough year, which is why your clients are going to be so reliant on you. And this last item, artificial intelligence and the future of work, this is something that's in the news all the time. Just thought I should share this figure with you. As we have gone through our lifetime, and as Americans have gone through the 20th and now the 21st century, we've seen a whole slew of new forms of technology. And so down here at the bottom, you can see electricity took over 40 years before 25% of the population adopted electricity in their homes. That was a long time ago. Telephone, it took 35 years. The television took 25 years. Look at how quickly the pace of adoption has accelerated as we've gone through some of these more recent technological changes that have really been technological revolutions. The PC took about 15 years, the mobile phone just over 12, the World Wide Web, 25% of the population embraced the World Wide Web within about 8 years. Here, smartphones, 5 years. Excuse me. The point is that artificial intelligence is just the next new form of technology. It's already being adopted on a widespread basis in many arenas, many industries. I'm sure you're already trying to figure out how to integrate it into your workflow and work patterns. And the question is, how's that going to affect the economy? Like all these other technological innovations, we've generally seen jobs will grow. Some jobs are going to be displaced, but there's a net positive job creation. And whereas jobs themselves may not be eliminated, functions will change. And I often point out when I'm in a live presentation that 20 years ago I had an office, I had a secretary who who answered my phone and all that kind of stuff. And today, I don't know if you can see it, but today my secretary is my cell phone and my Outlook, right? And that's the case for so many of us. Our functions and our tasks have changed as technology has entered into different aspects of our lives, both our work and our home life. So let's see. Here in the Inland Empire, I expect job growth. That the Inland Empire will continue to lead the region in job growth. The unemployment rate is going to be low but rising. And instead of relying as much on logistics growth as we did during the pandemic and several months thereafter, it's really going to be tourism and manufacturing and some of these population-serving sectors that are going to drive the economy and create jobs over the next 6 to 18 months. And then over the long term, we've got Brightline coming on board over the next several years. I think it's going to have a limited impact on job creation and the overall economy, but it certainly is a welcome opportunity for us to increase accessibility between the Southern California market and Las Vegas. And so the high desert stands to benefit at least to some degree from that. And then the longer term chicken egg problem for the Inland Empire and the high desert is that 21st century industries largely need an educated workforce that oftentimes has more than a high school degree, but that is sorely lacking in the workforce of the Inland Empire region. And so how do you get 21st century industries to locate in a region when they need to have a certain workforce with a certain skill level and a certain level of education? The answer to that question is that the region's got to be investing today to educate that workforce for tomorrow, because it's a long-term challenge that requires a long-term strategic solution. So make sure you keep that on your radar screen as you look forward to the future for the high desert economy and the housing. So on that, I'm going to stop and say thanks for your time today and see if there are any questions that I can take before we have to break. Christy, do we have time for a couple of questions?
Of course, if anybody has any questions, yes, please go ahead and unmute yourselves or ask me to unmute. And if you're okay with that, or did you want them to still type in the chat?
Unmute and just ask away. There is a question about the availability of the slides. And so I see Larry and Cecil and some others that I've known over the years. Hi, guys. Anyway, I will share this. I made a slight change to the deck.
The ones that you sent me already. Okay.
Yeah, so I'm going to send you an updated deck as a PDF, and then you can share that with the membership.
Okay, perfect.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Does anybody have any questions?
Let's see here. I see one new message coming in here. And I do thank you for hanging in there with me today. I know that's a lot of information. We don't get a chance to talk much, and there's so much more I could bring to you. I hope you find a few nuggets in this presentation that you can use in your consultation with your client. Anybody have any questions?
Hey, Robert, I have a question.
Yes.
First off, thank you for this presentation. Awesome. And thank you, Mike and the team, for inviting you on. Very helpful to us. My question is more about the savings rate. If we look at personal savings, I think Q3 of 21, it was at the highest level. And obviously, because of all the stimulus checks and we were on, lockdown, we were just starting to get out and about. So, we were spending money online, but the majority of us, saved that money. You look at the personal savings rate today and all that money is gone. And then you start to look at credit card debt, and credit card debt has risen. And so now, not only has it risen, you look at the delinquency rates. So my question to you is that, do you think that we have somewhat of a false reading on the resiliency of the consumer Are they using credit card debt to supplement what they're lacking in income to pay bills? And then I did see one other graph that shows that delinquency rate is right about 43% now. So it tells me that people are starting to get in trouble, credit card debt trouble. And how do you think that plays into, everything that you said? I mean, you've got some great graphs, and the visual really helps us to understand what's going on instead of you talking. So I do appreciate all those graphs, but if you can just comment on that.
Yeah, it's true that the savings rate has fallen since the pandemic, and you cited the middle of 2021. I don't have those numbers at hand, but that certainly sounds right, that the savings rate was quite high during that period of time when we couldn't spend our money, and we couldn't spend that stimulus money, nor could firms on the stimulus money they were getting on everything and anything they wanted. It was pretty much limited to goods. You couldn't buy services, so people stowed that away in their savings accounts and so on. Then they eventually started to spend that, and it's very true that some of that spending of that stimulus money continued well into 2023. Quite frankly, there's still stimulus money that is being released, if you will, through different government contracts and things that'll go all the way through, I think, to September 30th of this year. So we're still seeing some lingering effect of that. So you're right. People are relying more heavily on their forms of credit, including credit card debt. The rate of delinquency, so I look at credit card servicing as a share of income, and that has increased, but it has not increased to any sort of a danger zone that I have seen yet. So would not likely affect us this year, but maybe in 2024, that can be one of the sort of chinks in the armor that may cause consumer spending to soften if we don't see other things come forward. So you're right. We got to look at how people are paying for the stuff they buy, and so they'll pay for it out of their current income, or they'll pay for it out of their savings. If they don't have enough of each of those buckets to pull from, then they're going to use their credit card. Then we have to be worried about the extent to which they can service their credit card payment. I'm not sure about the 43%. I got that number seems high. I'm not sure what that metric is telling us. But what I've seen so far is that the indicators of stress in using credit, so delinquencies and defaults, they're rising, but they're still well below any sort of red light, warning signal. So we got to keep an eye on them. You're right. And this is a part of our normal ebb and flow in an economic cycle. We, Americans like their credit, and we do a very lousy job of saving money. So we're different from other countries where savings is a much bigger part of the overall management of household portfolio. Just is. Anybody else?
Okay, well, it doesn't look like it. I don't see anything in the chats. Nobody's coming forward. Robert, thank you so much. It was fantastic information. We always enjoy your presentation. So again, we just want to thank you, from the association, our presidents, everybody, our membership. But anyways, thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, everybody, and for attending today. I got to get up your way sometime. Maybe we're planning to have a fall presentation.
Yes.
So could be, we'll see how things go. Maybe we'll come up and see you in your office in Hesperia. It's been a while.
Perfect. That sounds great.
Have a good rest of your day, and best of luck through this busy season, everybody.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. Bye now.
Bye-bye.